So, did you guys know that I like A Song of Ice and Fire? Yeah, it may not be that obvious just how little I talk about it here on the channel, but I do. Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, which has recently concluded its second season, and while I enjoy that show in particular, it is not without its issues. And I feel like the issues of Season 2 have been talked about a bit more than the issues of Season 1, and it's not too surprising because there has definitely been a dip in quality. And this has even been recognized by the G-Man himself, who has taken to the internet to let it be known that he is less than thrilled about some of the places that Hot D is being taken to. But that's not what we're here to talk about today, as I'm letting my own thoughts be known, though I still look forward to seeing what he says in his blog. One of the main areas I think House of the Dragon has begun to drag in is the character department. A lot of the characters in this season make fairly questionable choices and decisions that kinda leave me scratching my head. And to clarify, it's not the fact that they're making bad decisions that's the issue. If anything, in a story, you want a character who makes choices that are less than optimal because it makes them seem more human. Because as a person yourself and a human being, not everything we do is going to be the right thing for us to do, logical, or have the best end result for us in the long run. The issue that Hot D shows is beyond that, though. It's that the bad decisions characters make don't make sense for those characters to make. Let me give an example to make that make a bit more sense. Take Ned Stark from Game of Thrones. What decision seems more likely for the character to make if he wants to save lives? Is it A, to tell his enemy how he plans to expose her to his best friend so that she can run away with her children and they don't die? Or B, to murder his best friend so his enemy and her children won't die? It's option A without a question, because it makes more sense for Ned's character in the long run. He loves Robert like a brother, so there's no way he'd kill him even if he didn't like some of the decisions he decided to go through with. Ned is also a very honorable man who has experienced a lot of death in his life. His father died, his brother died, his sister died, one of his sons almost died at the start of the show. But some of the deaths that really affected him came from people who weren't even related to him or close to him. He witnessed the aftermath of the death of Rhaegar Targaryen's family. The sheer brutality of their deaths is something that has haunted him for years, and his desire to not see it happen again is what motivates him to tell Cersei what he knows in the first place. It makes sense for his character. In order to not see history repeat itself and to keep to his own morals, he'd rather tell his enemies what he knows and risk retaliation than do something like murder his best friend, which would also arguably have the same end result, which would be saving their lives, preventing history from repeating itself, and perhaps even secure him a higher standing with those people he sought to save, as well as keep his own family safe in the long run. You could see the logic behind it, but it's a decision that is utter nonsense if you actually expect us to believe that it's one his character would make. And this is my issue with Alicent Hightower in Season 2 of House of the Dragon. Spoilers, obviously, for the latest season of Hot D if you haven't seen it already, so tread with caution. Also, I want to apologize in advance if my voice sounds weird at all during this recording. I mentioned this in my last video in the comment section, but recently I got sick and am still kind of recovering a bit, so if I sound a bit strange, blame it on that. But I want to ask you all a question, and I want you guys to really think about it before you answer and decide if it makes sense or seems acceptable, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Going back to Season 1 of House of the Dragon, and only focusing on Season 1, forgetting the events of Season 2 and how it ended, just think for a moment. If someone told you that Alicent Hightower, at the end of Season 1, a woman who stood in front of a dragon in what would have been a vain attempt to protect her child would betray him and sell him out to the enemy after they've been disfigured, crippled, and suffered the loss of a child at the end of Season 2, would you believe them? I wouldn't, and yet, that's exactly what happens on screen. You know, I'm well aware that Alicent didn't have the biggest fan base in Season 1. A lot of people thought and still think she's evil incarnate, the Wicked Witch of Westeros, the new Cersei Lannister, which seems really dumb if I'm being honest because Alicent isn't a power-hungry, incestuous narcissist, though I'm sure there are plenty of people who would love to debate me on some of those points. It's easy to get frustrated with the way a character acts, but it gets to a point where I honestly think you can't put all the blame on the character. Some of that has to go to the people responsible for writing them. And I'm not talking about the OG author, George Martin, since his version of Alicent is based in an in-world history book full of unreliable narrators. Majority of the things that Alicent does, and in Hot D in general, are made up entirely for the show. And some of the directions they take things, like the characters, are questionable, as I said earlier. Alicent in Season 1 of House of the Dragon is very different than in Season 2, which seems kind of obvious. I am aware that it's rare for a character to not change as a story moves forward. There are things called character progression and character development that causes them to change. But Alicent's change from protective mother to selfish betrayer within these 2 seasons does not make that much sense to me. When the show first aired, I believe that they painted a very interesting image of Alicent Hightower. As opposed to her book counterpart, who is a typical evil stepmother in fiction, she became someone who is very morally misguided, naive, and conditioned to value a system that has no real value for her. An antagonist, in my opinion, but not necessarily a villain. Many people don't know that being a villain or bad guy is different from being an antagonist. It's unsurprising since villains often take the roles of antagonists in a lot of media, but in reality, an antagonist is just someone who is the main opposition for the main character. Alicent is the opposition to Rhaenyra as she helped to keep her from the Iron Throne. But does that make her a villain? Sure, she keeps Rhaenyra from her inheritance, but does she actually enjoy the stress she is causing Rhaenyra? Does she delight in the prospect of conflict with Rhaenyra? There are a lot of ways you could go about that conversation about making a villain, but I've already done something akin to that in a previous video of mine. In fact, it was my very first video here on the channel, where I talked about why I don't believe Alicent, during the events of Season 1, is a monster like a lot of people tend to believe that she is. But in this video, I mainly want to talk about why I think the writers actually failed the character of Alicent Hightower. Her change seems unrealistic in Season 2, which may sound odd since, well, they wrote the character. How am I gonna say they didn't do her justice? Well, I feel like it can get to a point in writing where the characters take on a life of their own, and sometimes writers can be dishonest in portraying that life. Alicent Hightower was a character I found to be very complex in Season 1, but in Season 2, she seems to be more inconsistent if anything else. It's clear that the writers want to give her this moral conflict and comes to the realization that she chose the wrong side and that the system is corrupt, but the way they go about trying to establish these realizations and changes just takes away from the nuance that she had that originally made her so compelling. In the first season, as said earlier, Alicent is definitely presented as a character with misguided beliefs. To start with, Alicent really isn't someone with a goal of her own. Within the first 5 episodes, despite being a main character, she's more of an attachment to other people. She's Rhaenyra's best friend, Otto's daughter, the queen, the king's wife, and the mother of his children. Alicent is a tool, a cog in the gears of someone else's machine. Be that the machinations of her father Otto as he plots to make his grandson king, or the object of Viserys' need to expand and solidify the royal bloodline. Alicent doesn't have agency or her own real presence as her own person to start out with, and she admits to this as she says that no one really sees her as Alicent Hightower. They only really see the queen.
I like to believe I'm still the Lady Alicent, but all anyone sees when they look at me now is the queen.
Alicent's desire to have some kind of definition for herself is what makes her interesting despite not having a clearly defined goal at first. She is passive instead of active, because despite how much she dislikes her life, she has come to accept that this is her place in it, because she believes that she has no real choice. As she tells Rhaenyra when they're younger, not many people get opportunities like the princess does when it comes to finding a partner. Rhaenyra has scores of men across the continent vying for her hand, whereas Alicent was pushed to marry a man old enough to be her father for her own father's political ambitions. The situation is framed as something that she does not enjoy, but something that she follows through with because she feels she has to. This is what she's been taught and raised to believe in. Otto Hightower is a pretty unyielding man, and who sits in one of the highest positions in this society as Hand of the King. Despite being a second son with nothing to his name, his authority is only second to that of the royal family. Alicent always has to live up to a standard, regardless of if that's what she truly wants and believes in, and this becomes a pretty integral part to the character as the story moves forward. Alicent is very much a character that we see who doesn't necessarily like the hand she's been dealt, but plays the cards anyway because that's what she believes she has to do. She has to be an obedient daughter. She has to be a dutiful queen. She rolls with the punches as they come to her time and time again, with little resistance in her younger years, and even when she gets older. When she has another falling out with Rhaenyra because of her affair with Criston Cole, when her dad gets fired and she's pretty much on her own. Alicent clings to these things because it's what she knows, and because the idea that Rhaenyra, the heir to the Iron Throne with the most responsibility out of them all, shirks it, is a slap in the face to her. In the first season, Alicent has a certain type of nobility around her character, where she truly believes that she's doing the right thing, that she is the hero here. And this is why I felt so compelled by Alicent, because outside of her own jealousy for Rhaenyra, which I do believe was there and played a factor in some of her decisions, as Rhaenyra was the heir to the Iron Throne, doing whatever she wanted with little consequence, something that Alicent herself couldn't do, the jealousy that she felt was never the main motivator. Alicent genuinely feels justified in becoming Rhaenyra's opposition. She's not just out to punish her and get revenge for something. She truly believes that she is in the wrong because of those rules and doctrines that were ingrained into her as a child by her father. What it means to be honorable, to be a woman in Westeros, doing duties no matter what, putting the needs of your family first before your own, which is kind of ironic as Alicent doesn't tend to do that with her own children, but we'll get to that. That idea that sacrifices have to be made, even that of one's own happiness for the sake of the greater good that she believes in. Rhaenyra, in her eyes, has proven herself to be untrustworthy with her affair with Criston Cole, in the siring of numerous obvious bastard children, which is a pretty big offense in Westeros since bastards are hated in this world by most people. So the idea of the heir apparent not only having bastards, but passing them off as true-born when they clearly aren't, does not sit well. These repeated, arguably grievous offenses communicated to her that her father was indeed right all those years ago. There was no line for Rhaenyra. Maybe she would actually kill her siblings for power. Now, once again, to reiterate, this video is not to talk about how misunderstood Alicent is. Well, technically it is, because I'm talking about how I think the writers failed her character. But what I'm trying to convey here is that there are a lot of layers to Alicent's character that go beyond the selfishness that we got at the end of Season 2. As I said, in Season 1, Alicent was definitely a character who rolled with the punches no matter how bad things got. So the idea that all of a sudden that when it goes and gets tough, she just quits on her family really doesn't make that much sense. And the reason they try to get behind her sudden betrayal is honestly kind of stupid. Now, I'm not saying that she couldn't have had doubts or second thoughts as she begins to lose control, but having her go cold turkey entirely because of what? She lost all her power and influence over the council? Because her sons are pretty terrible people who won't listen to her? I don't buy that being her reason for betraying them for a second. One, because having power alone was not the motivation for Alicent Hightower in Season 1. Two, because her sons being terrible was never a deterrent for her character before. In fact, her children have always been her main motivation, and I think Season 2 honestly loses sight of this key aspect of Alicent's character, and that is her love for her children. Now, I've said this in plenty of my videos, that Alicent never wanted her kids. She never actually wanted to marry Viserys, and therefore never actually wanted to bear his children, because it's not something she actually ever imagined or chose for herself. Alicent is a fish out of water when it comes to being a mother, in her younger years and as an adult. But even with that being said, regardless on where you fall with Alicent as a character, be it as a villain or a misguided victim of a system, while you could question her character, one thing I felt was always unquestionable about her was her love for her children and willingness to go the extra mile for her family. Now, you may find that point debatable considering how she treats her oldest son, Aegon, but even with how terrible she treats Aegon, what I see behind that anger and frustration is a mother that is truly concerned for her son's life. Otto has always instilled the worst in Alicent, and told her since she was young that when Rhaenyra came into power, she would kill her children because they are a challenge to her reign. Of course, Alicent did not believe this at first and chose to have faith in Rhaenyra. But after putting that faith in her friend, she was rewarded with lies. An affair that could have gotten a man killed. A scandal waiting to happen as she had bastard children with no right to inherit, but somehow were in line for the successions of two of the realm's most powerful families. If Rhaenyra could go that far, who knows what else she could do. This is why she pushes so hard for Aegon to be king post 10-year time skip. Not because she solely wants power for herself, but because in her eyes, her family will be safe if they have power over Rhaenyra. is a means to an end, which ultimately causes her to treat her oldest son as more of a tool than a child, and contributes to why he becomes the way he becomes. And I'm not trying to make Alicent out to be a saint in this video, because she's not. As I said, I think she's a character with very misguided beliefs, but no real evil intent, like causing pain just for the heck of it, or grasping for power simply because that's what she wants. I think she is a well-meaning character, but goes about showing those intentions, that love for her children, terribly. Like how she abuses Aegon to make him see the same threats that she does when it comes to his sister. It's a mother trying to get her son to see the same danger she does, but is blind to the trauma she's giving him as a result. She is blind to what she's turning him into. But even when Aegon gets older and crosses that dark line, and it becomes clear that he is not a good person and probably wouldn't be a good king, Alicent admonishes him for his deeds, like assaulting Diana, and basically disowns him, but she never actually gives up on Aegon's life and throws him to the wolves. She doesn't just abandon her son, partly because she really can't. He's a Targaryen prince, and antics like this when it comes to noblemen are pretty common in this world. But this is also because this is a woman who on some level cared so deeply for her children that she would literally do anything for them. She valued his life, regardless of what he did. This is the same woman who was willing to attack the heir to the Iron Throne and the heir's child for an injustice done against her own child in the presence of the king himself, directly defying his order so she could have some kind of vengeance and justice for her family. Now, truthfully, there was a lot that went into that confrontation as well. There were a lot of repressed emotions behind Alicent's decision to act in such a crude way. But as a mother, a parent, to see your child maimed and disabled in such a way that will affect him for the rest of his life, who wouldn't be furious when no one tries to do anything about it and just says to forget it? And you expect me to believe that this same woman who was willing to defy the king and attack the heir to the throne is suddenly okay with her son being killed? The one she constantly failed as a mother, but always covered for during some of his most deplorable acts no matter what, who pushed for him to be king even when he proven that he was unfit, and he said himself that he was unfit. Now, granted, she did this because she genuinely thought that Viserys wanted him to be king, but Aegon's prior actions at the time were never a deterrent for her at all, a clue that this might not be a good idea in the long run. This is the same woman who was willing to face certain death by dragon for her son. But now she's okay with his public execution, even after the death of her grandson at the hands of Rhaenyra's husband. After Aegon was crippled by his own brother during the war, and really doesn't have much left to live for at this point. After all the suffering her son has been through, all the time that she has covered for him, pushed for him as a child, she sells him out at the end so that she can run away and be happy with her daughter and granddaughter. And that's not even mentioning the other parts of her family that she's selling out here. This is not going to end with Aegon. It'll start with him, but it'll continue with Aemond, who will see himself as Aegon's heir after his death, and most likely still continue to fight and be opposition for Rhaenyra. Then there's Daeron, who by law will be Aemond's heir, since Aegon has no other sons, since they wrote out Maelor for whatever reason. Would he just be happy about the death of his older brothers? Even if his dragon is young, would he really just sit back while his family is killed? If Aegon and Aemond die, he's the last living son of King Viserys. And even if Rhaenyra takes the Iron Throne, as long as a male claimant exists, there will be a challenge for her. I mean, we saw what happened with Alfred Broom and Daemon at Harrenhal. So if Daeron is the last brother standing, it only makes sense that Rhaenyra would have to kill him too in order to prevent retaliation from him and his potential descendants down the line. And the fact that Alicent doesn't even consider this genuinely bothers me. The fact that it won't end with Aegon, the fact that her worst fear, the death of her children, which I have explained has been her main motivation for wanting power, is now coming true. And she doesn't seem to care or put up much of a fight when it comes to her boys. Even signing the death warrant of a son she barely even knows and who is otherwise innocent. His only crime being a son of Viserys and supporting his brothers, and therefore being opposition to Rhaenyra by having an opposing claim to her throne. The conflict will continue, but since she, her daughter, and granddaughter get to be free and happy, It's fine. She even asked Rhaenyra, the woman who will be responsible for the deaths of her sons, to run away with her.
You speak as if from a distant dream. Come with me.
I feel like this is a grievous deviation from the character that they introduced. Someone who seemed to value her family so fervently despite their wrongdoing barely gives it a second thought when asked to let them die. Who doesn't even consider the death of her grandson when Rhaenyra says, a son for a son? A weak and hollow justification for wanting to kill Aegon outside of getting rid of the competition that was just thrown in for Rhaenyra by the writers. As if the death of Jaehaerys, a child, doesn't count because he wasn't the intended target. And Alicent, who has been trying to avoid the death of her family and death in general, just goes along with it. I think the writers really try too hard when it comes to making some of these characters sympathetic and well-intentioned. Alicent is a victim of this. While I don't have a problem with them making her a well-meaning, sympathetic, and misguided antagonist to the story, in fact, it's one of the changes they made that I like from the books, I do believe that they take it too far to the point of betraying her character. One key moment I think embodies this is the Last Supper of King Viserys. After the eye incident with Aemond on Driftmark, another 6 years has passed, and if she didn't seem like it already in episode 8, Alicent seems 10 toes down for Team Green. But after one speech from Viserys, one toast from Rhaenyra, all of a sudden, things are different. All of a sudden, that queen who was willing to go the extra mile to secure her children's ascent, even to go as far as to cover up a sexual assault to maintain her son's image, doesn't seem to care about the conflict about who gets to inherit the Iron Throne anymore. All of a sudden, her son losing his eye and being permanently disabled for life doesn't matter. Granted, it's been 6 years since that happened, but at this point, I don't know about you, but if I were a parent, I would never forget an incident like that as it pertained to my kid. But Alicent seems more than willing to let it go after 6 years for a woman she hasn't even seen since the incident, then questions why her son goes after them as if it's unthinkable. This same woman who held a grudge against Rhaenyra for 10 years because she had an affair and sired bastards. While I accept it, it doesn't really add up to me anymore, and I honestly think that Alicent's forgiveness was the first sign of her character going downhill. That and the fact that she seemingly didn't suspect that Otto was plotting to make Aegon king this whole time.
Am I to understand that members of the small council have been planning secretly to install my son without me?
Isn't this the whole reason she wanted him to come back to King's Landing to begin with? So she could have someone that supports her over Rhaenyra and her sons? Someone who could be partial to her the same way that Viserys is partial to Rhaenyra.
You cannot say, my queen, that your father would be impartial in this matter.
No, but he would be partial to me.
The last conversation we saw them have at this point was on Driftmark, when Otto was talking about how Alicent has what it takes to win the game, and how big it was that Aemond claimed Vhagar for them. But all of a sudden now, a coup seems unthinkable because she was kept out of the loop. When did Otto ever give any indication that he didn't want Aegon to be king? When did Alicent stop being a part of the plan? I understand her being naive, but the showrunners definitely make her feel more inconsistent and flip-floppy for the sake of making her sympathetic. She can be sympathetic and be constant opposition. Alicent was a character that, even though she didn't like her circumstances, she was willing to go the distance because that was what was required of her when it came to the security of her family. But all of a sudden, family doesn't matter as it has no benefit for her anymore. She loses her power, her children won't listen, so what's the point of staying around? Never mind that her grandson was murdered or anything, let me run off with the women in my life while leaving my sons to die. One of them who I haven't even raised myself or seen in years. It just feels wrong for her. Honestly, with the way Alicent was interpreted in Season 1, I think it would have made much more sense in Season 2 if we still had that sympathetic route with Alicent, having her have those doubts about her family and position, but still ultimately choosing to fight for them because there is no going back with the death of Lucerys and Jaehaerys. And they try to touch on that when she has that whole talk with Rhaenyra in the Sept about how things have gone too far, blood has been shed, only for her to go back on her word later and suddenly want to run off with Rhaenyra. and the way they go about her flip, it just doesn't make sense and does not sit right with me. With what we were shown, how in Season 2, Alicent begins to see how she led Aegon to his current state in life, I think would have made way more sense for her character, at least the one they tried to portray, if she actually helped work with Larys to help Aegon escape King's Landing. They had a whole partnership at one point, and I'm surprised that even if Larys did side with Aemond over her, that she never really sought his counsel again after the fact for other issues. I think it would have done wonders for her character and spoken to her complexity and progression as a person if after everything, she realizes that everything she did out of love and misguided fear for her children, pushing them to claim power for their own protection, only put them in more danger. And in a way, to resolve that issue and make amends for how she treated Aegon growing up, she helps him escape so he can have some kind of opportunity at life that she kinda stole from him. I think that kind of conversation between the two of them as they prepare for his escape would have been much more in line with her character and more interesting to see than whatever they had going on with her and Rhaenyra at the end. I mean, the fact that she cares more about Rhaenyra than her own children, specifically her sons, after how much she pushed for them, and the fact that she doesn't even truly know Rhaenyra anymore after 10 years of animosity and 6 years in isolation, the fact that she is willing to abandon most of her kids for her at this point is something that does not sit right with me and seems like such a disservice to this character. But the relationship of Rhaenyra and Alicent deserves a video all on its own. I just still can't wrap my head around the direction they took Alicent this season. Season 1 Alicent actually felt like a character I could see some people getting behind as you look at the world through her eyes as a Westerosi noble woman taught to value the rules and the restrictions placed on her above all else, then seeing the person who should have the most restriction out of everyone spit in the face of it. A lot of her actions could feel understandable and even real to an extent when looking at it through the views of their world and not the modern one. Season 2, I think, just really loses the grasp of the character and what made her complex and compelling in the first place for the sake of overused sympathy that makes her more inconsistent than anything else. But these are just my thoughts, and I thank you guys for listening to this rant. You guys let me know how you feel about the direction they took Alicent this season, and I will see you all next time.